The Classics World YouTube channel has recently hit 50,000 subscribers, and a huge thank you to everyone who supported us over the past 5 years. And we thought we should mark that auspicious occasion with some sort of special video, maybe a road trip. And rather unimaginatively, we've come up with the idea of going for a drive in 3 classic cars that were debuted in 1974, 50 years ago this year in 2024. So, introducing the MK1 Volkswagen Golf, the Volvo 200 series and the Citroen CX. All 3 were introduced in 1974. They don't have a lot more in common other than they were introduced into an increasingly turbulent time for the automotive industry. So let's take a little drive out with this trio of classic cars to see which one we prefer. So, VW were considering a replacement for the Beetle as far back as the mid-50s, but the loveable bug was still a huge seller internationally, so there really wasn't the imperative to replace it. But come the 1970s, like a lot of car makers, VW was in a bit of trouble. Economic turmoil around the world, and particularly in key markets like North America, meant that sales started to tumble. So Wolfsburg commissioned Giorgetto Giugiaro to pen the replacement for the iconic Beetle. And what was very much in vogue at the time, Giugiaro went for a minimalist, simple, striking design. And the other radical thing, of course, that happened is that Volkswagen ditched the air-cooled engineering of the Beetle and adopted water-cooled instead. A division that exists to this day with VW diehards, with enthusiasts either loving air-cooled or water-cooled, but seldom both at the same time. But the approach with the Golf was to really go with conventional engineering, but just execute it really well. So to that end, gone with the air-cooled engines, and up front we've got a range of 4-cylinder petrol engines driving the front wheels via a 4-speed manual gearbox or a 3-speed automatic. Traditional McPherson strut suspension up front, semi-independent dual trailing arms at the back, disc brakes up front, drums at the rear, rack and pinion steering. A tried and tested engineering formula, but just done very well, as you would expect from the Volkswagen team. And that formula was clearly a successful one. By 1975 it had jumped into the top 15 in the UK sales charts, and it was the runner-up in the Car of the Year contest of the same year, losing out to the Citroen CX. And it just became a huge success internationally. In 1976, of course, we saw the introduction of the fuel-injected GTI model, and there launched a whole breed of hot hatches that ultimately saw the demise of the great British sports car. A diesel model was also introduced in 1976, and then a couple of years after that we saw the 4-door Jetta, we saw the Caddy pickup, the Cabriolet, and ultimately a van derivative by 1980. So a derivative and a model to suit every taste and every budget. And it sold well all around the world. In North America it was called the Rabbit, and in South Africa it was known as the City Golf. There were some subtle revisions in 1979 and indeed 1980, and by 1983 that iconic GTI model got upgraded with a 1.8 fuel injected engine. And shortly after that the MK1 gave way to the subtly improved Mk2 model. But what a success story it had been. By the turn of the 80s, Volkswagen had sold over 7 million Golfs around the world. And here we are now, 50 years on from that launch, and 8 generations in, and VW have sold over 37 million Golfs internationally, making it surely one of the world's best-selling cars ever. And that success has to be attributed to how fundamentally right that concept was from the get-go. And we're driving this lovely example today. I was really glad we got a GL spec rather than an all singing, all dancing GTI one. It belongs to the Volkswagen UK heritage fleet, but what an absolutely glorious car it is. The steering is light and yet communicative. The suspension is agile, and yet the ride quality is actually quite decent. It feels nippy round a corner, and yet actually it's pretty good at covering the bumps as well. The brake pedals are a little bit soft, bit of travel there, but the brakes work very effectively. This interior is a simplicity masterclass. it's well screwed together. The switchgear is well positioned and good quality. The gauges are absolutely crystal clear, beautifully sighted. I love the square speedometer and the square rev counter. The gear change from this 4-speed manual box is delightful. It's really easy, smooth, intuitive. You can just see why this was a success. It's easy to drive. There's no idiosyncrasies that make it unusual in any market. You can see why the appeal is global. So yeah, I really love it. I can't profess to be a VW expert like Paul here, who's driving the Volvo today, but I have owned a couple of Golfs myself and I've always been a fan of them. I just love their simplicity. Simple, basic engineering, but executed so well. That's the key to the Golf's success, and I absolutely love it.
It's funny really, I've got personal history with all of these three cars. I grew up with 80s VWs, so you know, the Golf is something I remember really clearly from my own childhood. I stuck my head in earlier on, and that 80s VW smell took me right back to my teenage years. And the Citroen CX, well, I had a CX as a project car in a magazine I worked on back in the early 2000s. A turbo too, we even took it to the Nürburgring, and I do love CXs. I remember my dad bringing one home when he worked at Haynes, the manual people, and me and my sister thought it was like a spaceship riding in that thing. But the one that I've got most of an emotional connection with is the Volvo 240. I remember driving them and being driven in them loads when I was in Canada when I was about 18, and they were really popular in Eastern Canada, these cars. They're so durable, and of course the Canadian and the Swedish winters are pretty similar, and you know, the car that was designed for Scandinavia worked pretty well in the harsh Nova Scotia winter. And I remember loving them for their sort of durability, and they're quite unshowy sort of cars, but in comparison with the American cars, they looked really sort of fancy and sleek and European. But they do have that unburstable sort of quality, and this one has done an astounding 288,492 miles, and to be honest, it still drives pretty well. I mean, you might hear the diff on the sound, and it is quite noisy, but otherwise, you know, it drives well. And these, you know, these are really made to last, these cars. They're funny really because they were produced from 74 right until 93, but they were sort of a little bit old-fashioned when they were launched in a way, you know, a little bit like the BMW E28. They were sort of staid looking, you know, rather than the last word in sort of design sophistication. But they didn't need to be anything else. They were sort of, you know, neat and inoffensive, and that was what the buyers wanted, because it was a conservative sort of buyer that went for these Volvos, really. Someone who wanted a quality car in the mould of a BMW or a Mercedes, but just didn't want to be flashy, you know. So someone who wanted to be able to cart all the family stuff on holiday every year down to the south of France, but they didn't know what the Nürburgring was, and they didn't care. You know, they wanted a durable family car of quality that lasted. You can see why Volvo built up such a great reputation. It's a funny car to drive, really, because it feels at once quite sort of modern and indomitable and sort of unburstable, and you could drive it right across Europe without it failing. But it also feels quite old-fashioned in other ways. They've always got a little bit of a sort of wiggle to the rear. They tend to sort of shimmy over broken surfaces, a little bit like a Cortina, to be honest. It's not that sophisticated at the rear end. But the big change actually from the 140 series to the 240 was rack and pinion steering and McPherson strut front, but the rear end wasn't terribly advanced. They didn't make many changes there, so it's it's all it needs to be. It's amazing really that they managed to continue the car from launch in 74 right through to 93 without really changing the design at all. There was a facelift in 79, and then there was another facelift in 81 that gave it the big square headlights that this car's got. And this one's an 88, so it's relatively late model. It's a 2-litre GL, so it's about 100 horsepower, but it only weighs about 1,300 kilos, and you know, it gets along all right with the manual box. It's a 5-speed on these later cars, when the earlier cars had a flick overdrive switch on the gear knob, and it feels quite smooth once you get it up to speed. It was the 240 that debuted the Volvo B-Series engine. It's an overhead cam design. The previous engines have been a pushrod motor, and it's got that characteristic sort of whirring sound, but it's quite a smooth engine actually. Just a 4-cylinder, 2-litre, 2.1 or 2.3, and they all sound quite sort of muscular in a sort of quiet, understated sort of way. But they always have that sort of whirring sound, which I always thought was characteristic of these 240s. We didn't get the turbo version in the UK. It's a shame really, because they're actually quite lively. Compared to the Citroen, it feels really sort of staid, but in many ways it is the better car, of course. You know, it's more conventional, it's more easily maintained, and you know, there are a lot more Volvo 200 series around the place now than there are Citroen CXs. They're certainly made of slightly stronger metal than the Citroens. So today Volvo is very much a premium brand, you know, it is right up there with BMW and Mercedes, but back in the day, certainly when this car was new, Volvo was a sort of almost premium brand, or it was a brand for people who didn't want to show off too much, you know, someone who wanted a nice car. They weren't too concerned about performance, but they really didn't want to be showy. Bought a Volvo, you know. It wasn't a cheap car, but it didn't shout that it was an expensive car either. And that was their sort of niche in the market. You wanted a practical car of quality. You didn't want to be too showy. It's got a very different character from the other two, though. The Golf obviously is a small hatchback, but it feels like it was designed to be sort of, you know, sprightly and peppy and a fun sort of city car. And it does have the edge on handling, and you know, it's probably quicker. But the CX, obviously, the Citroen is just totally different. The styling and the detail touches and the hydro pneumatics and all that sort of stuff, it is very different. But this car is resolutely conventional, but it's just been engineered for a detail level to just last and just to be the ultimate in practical, durable transport. And that's its strength, you know.
If the car buying public weren't quite so fickle, the Citroen CX wouldn't have been needed in 1974, because the cars it replaced, the Citroen D Super and the Citroen D Special, were both still head and shoulders above cars like the Ford Granada, the Rover 2000 and the Vauxhall Victor. But people get bored of buying the same thing over and over again, and by 1974 cars based on the DS had been available for very nearly 2 full decades. Citroen had to up its game, and it started by replacing the lower spec versions of the DS family with this, the Citroen CX. The car had been planned to use a 3-rotor rotary engine developed jointly with NSU, an engine that would have been fantastically smooth and would have suited the very ethos of Citroen. But the problem was that 1974 came just after the 1970s oil crisis, and the twin rotor unit in the GS bi-rotor was ferociously thirsty. It looked like the CX with its triple rotor would be worse still. We're talking teens. So Citroen backed out of that idea and threw in the engine from the old DS. Launched as a 2-litre and a 2.2, by 1976 there was a Safari Estate, a 2.4, and a long wheelbase Prestige, which married the Safari's long wheelbase chassis and rear doors with the rear bodywork of the saloon to create a true DS replacement. Various changes over the years, including the introduction of a new 2-litre engine developed with Renault and also used in the 18, and the GTI Turbo of 1984, meant that the CX always stayed ahead of the pack. The Turbo in particular showed cars like the Saab 900 Turbo and the Rover Vitesse how a performance executive car should be done. Not only was it £500 cheaper than the Saab, but it was £2,500 less than the Rover, and it could outhandle the pair of them. The car that looked massively ahead of its time in 1974 still looked suitably modern when it came to 1991. That's the thing about the Citroen CX. Like the Volvo that we have here, that Mr. Wager is driving, this is a late example. This is a 1988 car. It was developed to compete with the Ford Granada Mark 1 and to compete with the Vauxhall Victor and the Rover P6. By the time this car was built, it was competing with the Ford Granada 2-litre GL, the Rover 800 and the Audi 80, and people still bought it because it was still ahead of its time. There are 2 cars that people hold up as icons, as examples of design that truly changed the game: the Citroen DS and the Jaguar E-Type. I'm here to tell you that the Citroen CX should be added to that exclusive list.
Okay then chaps, we've had a pleasant day driving our class of 74, the Citroen CX, Volvo 200 and the VW Golf. What are our thoughts, Sam?
Well, only one of them has ever been European Car of the Year, hasn't it?
The Citroen CX.
Yeah, to be honest, I think that's a conclusion there. I don't think we need to discuss the other two, do we?
Well, I think we should discuss that a bit further, because I think you're right, it did win European Car of the Year, and in fact it beat the Golf that's also here. Mm-hmm. But it's also the one that sold the least out of the 3, isn't it? So
well, that just makes it more exclusive.
It does. And actually I do like the fact that the CX is quirky. It's certainly the most distinctive of the 3 here. it also arguably had the toughest job in terms of replacing something so visionary as the DS.
Well, I'm not really sure it did have the toughest job, you see, Phil, because the Golf had to compete in what I think was the toughest sector, the small family car sector. That had to compete with cars like the Escort, the Viva, the Allegro. And it did. It managed to do that because it was seen as a premium car, because back in the 1970s, European and especially German stuff was still seen as premium. It used to be a lot more expensive than it was, but then we joined the common market, things got cheaper. The Golf had that image, but it was no more expensive than something like an Allegro was.
Which we were struggling to bolt together by the mid-70s. I mean, they were...
You mean they were bolted together?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, blue tack probably. But I don't know, it's... I think what the Golf managed to do was replace something as iconic as the Beetle using sort of really fundamental, basic engineering, quite traditional kind of front-engined, water-cooled engines, but just executed it really well.
Yeah, it was a big gamble for VW, the Golf. You've got to remember that. The company was really wedded to the success of the air-cooled rear-engine cars, and I think even within VW there was some reluctance to pursue this newfangled path.
Right at the top there was, throughout the 60s, Nordhoff wouldn't entertain the idea of front-wheel drive. The only reason he bought Auto Union and brought Audi's front-wheel drive in, he wanted the space in order to make more Beetles. It was only when Nordhoff died that Volkswagen was free to do things like the Golf.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't the first front-wheel drive water-cooled VW, but it was the most successful by a long way. Well, you can still buy a Golf, can't you?
37 million, I think it is, sales to date, which is extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, it makes it sort of one of the best-selling cars of all time.
Yeah, well, I mean, I remember the Mark 1 from my own childhood. Grew up with VWs. We've got a Mark 7.5 GTI at home still. There you go, you know.
And I remember I was talking to someone the other day actually about the Golf, that it's still probably the car that would suit 99% of people's requirements 99% of the time. I mean, people don't obviously, but it's still fundamentally a car that will serve most people's purposes for a family car.
I can't help but notice we've not mentioned the Volvo.
No, and yet I am a fan of the Volvo.
Quietly competent, that's the trouble.
And the thing is, the Volvo 200 series is that it's actually, for me, a perfect embodiment of what I think of as a Volvo. You know, really reliable, really sturdy build quality, it feels really safe and solid, everything you want a Volvo to be.
But then again, is it a 70s car in the first place? Because what you have to remember with the 240 is that it's fundamentally a heavy facelift of the 140 that came out in 1966.
True.
It's a 60s car.
Yeah,
well,
I guess.
Yeah, a 1970s interpretation maybe.
Different suspension and engine, isn't it? But yeah, it does have an old school feel to it. But I think the whole secret of Volvo's success was its unshowy but very competent nature, and that's why we haven't really mentioned it.
Yeah,
it's not very exciting, but it's very good.
I think it serves its purpose sort of really well. It is probably the least, I don't know, striking in terms of what came before and after it. It very much sort of followed a familiar pattern for Volvo back then, but it doesn't make it any lesser a car, I think. I was looking up interesting points of history in 1974. So ABBA won the Eurovision Song Contest, so that's a score for the Volvo. Mm-hmm. Go Sweden. And Germany won the World Cup, so that's go Golf. I couldn't really think of anything for France. I think,
well, it had the Citroen CX. What else did it need?
Charles de Gaulle Airport opened in Paris. There you go. That's your French doth of a cap.
Somewhere at that opening ceremony, was there a CX maybe?
Probably, yeah. All the dignitaries were chauffeured there. I don't know, but the question is, which one would you take home? You can't say the CX because you've already taken it home because it's your car. But
well, I can. It just means I put my money where my mouth was. And it's not
true.
The first CX I've had either.
So in all seriousness, actually, out of the three, would you take the CX?
Yes.
Okay. Paul?
Well, I love the Volvo actually because I've got personal history with them, and it's very sort of competent, you know, and it's a good car really, but it's not very exciting, is it? And I've had a CX as well. I had a turbo, but I do really like Golfs, and GL. I love that GL because there's so few of those basic models have survived. But what I really like is the Mark 1 GTI, and I could combine the French flair of the CX and the Mark 1 GTI by having the French market. Oettinger says superb, the 16S 16 valve Mark 1. Maybe would that be allowed?
Yeah, why not?
GTI.
We can make the rules. I mean, I have to say, I like all three, but picking a favourite for me, it does land on the Golf.
Yeah.
It's probably the safest choice of the three, but it's just so competent. And as you said, it was a bold move to go from that iconic air-cooled Beetle shape to go to something so minimalist but clean-cut lines.
Yeah.
I just think, as a design exercise, it was spot on. That concept has now lasted for 50 years and continues to be a success. I love it. I would take the Golf. I think it still drives like a modern car. But I'd really be interested to know what you guys think at home. You know, out of those 3 cars, which one would you take and have on your driveway? But in the meantime, thanks very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed our trip down memory lane and our class of 74 to celebrate 50,000 subscribers of Classics World YouTube. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Day with VW diehards. I almost ran over a cat.